Hello, this is Thomas Barnett, sitting here at Throughline's headquarters in Adams Morgan in wonderful downtown Washington, D.C. I just had a great conversation with Greg Crabb, a fascinating individual with a long career in law enforcement, surprisingly enough, at the U.S. Postal Service. And he has gone on from that career to found and be the principal player at a cybersecurity consultancy called 10-8 LLC. It was our privilege to host Greg at Throughline's headquarters and have a discussion about cyberspace and other issues in relation to the United States and its growing rivalry and competition with the Chinese. The following podcast provides excerpts from that discussion that we thought would be relevant to share with you all, our audience.
My name is Greg Crabb. I am the founder of a cybersecurity consulting firm called 10-8 Cyber. For 30 years of my professional career, I was a government employee, 25 of which was as a federal law enforcement officer with the United States Postal Inspection Service.
Well, I think the question about globalization being net negative or net positive is really caught up in this unfolding reality of China having risen. As long as China was on its move and was taking advantage of a vast, cheap labor pool, which had a time limit on it, then globalization was expanding in terms of interregional trade. Now that China has kind of passed through its demographic dividend and is starting to age and lose population, it's only natural that globalization returns to a sort of a regionalist pattern for a period of time, maybe for the long haul, because now China and East Asia are their own manufacturing and demand hub, in addition to the EU, in addition to the United States.
From my perspective on kind of globalization, I believe that we've seen some major shifts in obviously what you were talking about relative to supply chain and the ability to get commodities manufactured in a very cost advantaged way. And now I think that we understand the price of that from a societal perspective, and I think we're going to see shifts, as the population kind of recognizes that, or as leadership recognizes that we need to leverage populations in a different way. And, I believe that when you look at organizations like the United Nations and you talked about regionalization, there's some very important regional distinctions that I think from a cultural perspective are going to be very difficult to pierce to get to a completely one world.
Right.
And I think to your point, I think regionalization will continue to dominate over globalization.
I think another way to take a swing at the question as to whether globalization is good or bad at this point in history is just to kind of understand that it's reached a tipping point. The reduction of poverty around the world and the creation of wealth has been magnificent the last 70 years, really pulling more people out of poverty and creating more wealth around the world than in the previous 500 years. So we've accomplished something with globalization, the United States, I would argue, that a lot of people thought could never really happen, and that is the creation of a majority global middle class. But that achievement is almost immediately put at risk by the question of how the world deals with all that demand. It's kind of easy to deal with poor people. They want protection from their circumstances. Rich people want, frankly, protection from poor people. But the middle class wants the hardest thing to deliver, which is they want protection from the future. They've got a decent life and they want to hold on to it. And if you look back at when the middle class emerged in Europe and the United States, turn of the 20th century, we got Bolshevism and we got fascism as responses and 2 world wars and genocide and dictatorships and all sorts of scary stuff. The United States threaded that needle with a pair of Roosevelts, Theodore and Franklin. The question now is, we run this experiment on a global level, and what are we seeing? We're seeing ethno-nationalist strongmen arising. We're seeing charges of communism and socialism and all the old names being tossed in both directions. So I got to argue globalization definitely a net plus up to this point in history, but now we face this unusual opportunity, and it really does unfold amidst a renewed superpower competition to win those hearts and minds and to integrate those countries and win all those subscribers and everything else.
Yeah, excellent question relative to how are we addressing this logical connection that we have versus the physical connection that we have. And I often think about when you drive around a neighborhood, you get a sense of how safe it is in that neighborhood. When you're online, your neighborhood is a logical neighborhood and not a physical neighborhood. And I think that in the United States, we have a set of rules and standards and protocols that we're trying to promote and develop around how business should be conducted. However, the neighborhoods around the world are not delivering the same. And I believe that, the moment that you connect your device to that wire, those factions around the world that have different values and beliefs are right next door. And I think that we need to really think about what this logical neighborhood looks like that is cyberspace, and how do we really improve it from a global perspective to be in line with all of the values that we want to see here in the United States, but recognize that it's very difficult to force upon those other communities our values, right? It's a huge clash that we're in the midst of, and quite frankly, we're not in a very safe neighborhood.
What China's trying to do is basically create what it considers to be, from its perspective, safe zones around the world. And it's sort of like the old British counterinsurgency ink spot strategy. They just want to create these little safe nodes and link them up together, and on that basis create sort of an alternative globalization. They can do it with infrastructure, and they definitely see a way of doing it through cyberspace. And that kind of ambition is not something we have. We haven't been comfortable with the notion of that kind of integration for quite some time on an external basis, because we consider it, well, we've always been subject to the charge of Americanization and cultural imperialism. And so we've gotten kind of soft on that. The Chinese are coming into a lot of places around the world that are interested in getting connected to 5G and are taking a very attractive offer from Huawei and other Chinese telecom companies, offering notions of a safe city and all the surveillance that goes with that. That's allowing them to really kind of come in and penetrate these societies, give them the illusion of a walled garden that protects them from a dangerous world that they can't control in terms of cyberspace. But it also kind of locks them into a network that China can control and have unusual access over. And it really does kind of give you the opportunity for an Orwellian state of kind of omnivalence, where your every move is being recorded and kind of held against you. And we see these kinds of things with the Chinese and the social credit system they developed, basically a scorecard as to your fitness as a citizen. And, from the American side, we look at that mostly in terms of what Amazon pushes at us in terms of products by watching everything, you go on and you search for a dog toy, and then pretty soon everywhere you go in the universe on the in cyberspace, there are dog toy ads coming at you. Well, the Chinese are using that kind of approach really as kind of a social conditioning. And I think we need to understand what they're trying to do, because they're kind of locking in large chunks of the planet to a perspective that we're going to find in conflict with our own.
Yeah, I think the values are completely different relative to the approach that we're taking versus the approach they're taking. And the economics are very different as well.
Sure.
If our businesses need to compete with a government-led surveillance society, those objectives are very different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm China and I want to penetrate and surveil Africa and anywhere they can get their technology implemented at scale from a smart cities perspective, there's a lot of not only social value but economic efficiency that comes from that is going to be very difficult for America and American business to be able to penetrate and counter.
Dislodge.
Yeah, dislodge is because the fiefdoms of American corporations, although they have a lot of autonomy to be able to capture market opportunities around the world, they don't get all of the economic benefit that you would obtain from a surveillance economy like a China. I think it's an interesting development that we need to really take a step back and understand and think about relative to our approach on how to support our values against that type of counter approach.
I think from a perspective of a developing economy, the last 20 years in globalization have been fairly tumultuous. And, the United States tends to come in with all sorts of bromides and hectoring and sanctions and whatnot to elicit the desired behavior. Whereas the Chinese come in and basically say, hey, I can calm that all down for you. Yeah. I can give you controls that you don't have now. If your emerging middle class is becoming restive, if you have insurgencies, if you have terror problems in your country, I can give you that sort of security. It doesn't require me to send the PLA. It just requires you to allow me to kind of wire up a surveillance society that you can have access to, and for the price of submission, we're going to have access to as well. And it's an interesting trade that I think we discount at our peril, because a lot of these countries are looking at a very competitive landscape. They're very interested in getting connected on 5G networks, not being left behind, and yet they're scared about what it's going to do to their society and their ability of their government to control it. And China's meeting all that fear and addressing it very effectively. And instead, we're still harping on marketization, clean up your judiciary and stuff like that. Much harder things for small nations to accomplish. So unless we start to offer a pathway to those governments that is as attractive or as comforting as the one that the Chinese do, warts and all, I think we're going to lose on a case-by-case basis around the planet, for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think that when you look at the development of technologies and the head of intelligence for Cyber Command posted on his LinkedIn the other day. So the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence in video surveillance in China.
Right.
It was the use of those technologies to shame people from jaywalking on a city street in China. So if you jaywalked, your picture was flashed up and your identity was flashed up on a big monitor. that's not the way we do things here in the United States. But when you think about what the back end technology infrastructure that they're developing with that type of mass surveillance capability, and how that can be easily replicated across the world, I think it gets to your point of that kind of Orwellian surveillance society that we need to be concerned about.
Because they're really getting people to police themselves.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we've all seen how the gamification of environments can alter behavior pretty strongly. If you have certain perks that you get by racking up airline miles, well, then all of a sudden you're doing all sorts of things to make that happen. And they don't have to make you do that. They just put that carrot out there, and then you're changing your behavior on that basis. With the Chinese here, I mean, they do it both on the negative side, the shaming and the restriction of access to services, and on the positive side, the better you behave, the more the world opens up for you, and the better your services, maybe the better the apartment you can gain, maybe the easier your travel and that kind of stuff. And it really does kind of take the onus from the state in terms of policing and puts it on the individual and says to them, these are the pluses and minuses in response to your behavior. What are you going to do about it? And the average person gets worn down or conditioned by that fairly quickly. And that's the kind of control that I think, the Chinese are much more comfortable with as a society and certainly as a state, but it's something that's fairly scary from our perspective and really would go way beyond the bounds of what we've experienced, say, with an Amazon or a Google up to this point in history.
I'm fascinated by what happened in 2016 relative to Facebook and the election.
Sure.
And most of the United States doesn't understand how that technology was leveraged against us by an adversary.
Right.
Now, we're trying to understand how to put controls and police social media companies and, across Europe and across the United States. You look at what's going on with TikTok now, and, they have a different cultural view from a Chinese perspective on the use of that type of collection technology. But in the same way, how are those two different from, an adversarial approach leveraging Facebook to hurt the elections in 2016 versus TikTok gaining their surveillance and, to your point, behavioral conditioning that they want to see kind of run? Where does this lead us? How do we take these kind of different views on the use of technology? Ultimately, this is where artificial intelligence is going, machine learning. Where is that going to end up with, the United States and our complex saying, hey, here's the rules and norms. China, Russia, and others saying, we have a different set that we want to play by. And, do we view their rules and methods as adversarial to ours? Or, how does that develop? It's a fascinating problem set that I'm struggling with to try to really think about long term, how we drive that forward and how we protect ourselves from those adversarial uses of that technology, because we're not going to be able to impact what's going on in China, for example, relative to those values and norms.
Yeah, I think China's approach is to create facts on the ground as much as possible in terms of infrastructure. And then on that basis, compete with the United States for allegiance and loyalty and eyeballs and attention span in a global marketplace where they're willing to use conditioning tools through the gamification of these social media that we would find a little too intrusive. And it's interesting and challenging for a country, I think, like the United States, where the average young person today, their sense of allegiance, their sense of belonging, their sense of identity can be fractured across so many different venues that, being American is just one of them. And it's easily escapable on many levels. They can go off and be different kinds of personalities, different kinds of personas, enjoy different sort of avatars in different environments. And that can become the bulk of their identity without them realizing it, and can expose them to these kinds of conditioning environments that really make cyberspace more likely the battle space between the United States and China than certainly the physical world, where I think the Chinese are much less aggressive in their approach and much more careful and wary about the consequences of what they do. I don't think they've run into anything that really penalizes them enough or makes them feel chastened in their approach yet. And to a certain extent, that's because the United States hasn't really mounted a counter effort in that cyber realm. We take a fairly hands-off approach. And I think it's starting to hurt us now, because I think it's really the place where hearts and minds are going to be one in the future, and identities captured.
Yeah, captured or manipulated. One of the things that I'm fascinated relative to the development of technology and kind of the decentralization of community with the internet, I see that there's in some ways a push to decentralize community in the internet, where you are responsible for your own community. You can develop the way of the following, the individuals that you bring into your community on the internet in a very unique and personally valuable way. But also that decentralization allows for these large nation states in order to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. There's not a centralized approach to be able to address these issues, and you've got China off doing what China wants to do. But it also begs that we may find in the decentralization of the development of this technology other adversaries that develop capability here in a very fast way that, when you purchase a gun, you can use a good gun to go hunting and to protect your family, or you can use the gun to commit a crime and hurt individuals. Computers are the same way. For most of my law enforcement career, I saw the use of computers from an instrumentality of a crime perspective. It comes down to intent in order to understand what that actor is going to be doing with the use of that technology. When we look at artificial intelligence, what's the actor behind the use of that technology? What's their intent? And when you get this decentralized development of these technologies that, we're all fascinated by generative AI right now, but, in China, they're developing AI. Russia, they're developing it. Terrorism groups, if they're not developing it, they soon will be. And the intent that they have is not going to be community building such that we would have in the United States.
It's about isolating and controlling individuals en masse.
Exactly.
And that's that sense of, Francis Fukuyama talked about it with his book, The End of History. At the end of the book, he talked about wars of the spirit. And what he really meant by that phrase was, in effect, kind of wars over identity. And that's come to pass to a great extent with the culture wars in the United States and elsewhere. Everybody's concerns tend to focus on their identity. And when we're talking about this cyberspace as a competitive space between great powers, superpowers, there is that capacity to come in and isolate and condition and alter, and on that basis capture the allegiance of individuals. And we've seen that, I think, quite ably with the Russian effort in the 2016 election and how they were able to depress an African-American vote to a stunning degree, just out of the blue, kind of unexplainable by any other means, and capturing a significant chunk of the Republican base, which to me is one of the great, heists of the century to date. I mean, that's really an amazing outcome, to the point where there's a good chunk of our population that has more trust in Vladimir Putin than in our own government. And so I think that whole idea of kind of raiding each other's kitchens, is already here. Citizens are up for grab. Identities are up for grab. And that's why I think it's absolutely more important now. And, we all saw the recent polls that came out and said the average American's sense of patriotism has gone down fairly dramatically. Well, there's a lot more competition for that identity now, and it's a lot more fierce. And frankly, the United States hasn't done a great job the last 15, 20 years. I've got 2 millennials and 4 Gen Zs as kids, and none of them are particularly proud of the flag or want to be associated with the U.S. brand of the last 20 years, which to me is deeply disheartening. But then I look at it from their perspective, and I see, what have they gone through in the last 20 years? And it hasn't been a great performance, and there hasn't been a whole lot to be proud of. And there isn't much of a sense right now that we're moving in a direction that they want to be part of, that they get to participate in building. And so I think we got to look at this cyberspace challenge and the struggle for allegiance on an individual basis. We have to look at this not just on a defensive level. I think that's way too reactive. I think we have to look at it on an offensive level and say, not only how do we protect our citizens from this sort of capture, this kind of body snatching by unseen forces, but how do we build something positive that they adhere to?
One of the things that really pops in my mind is innovation, right? We had a huge lead when it came to innovation, the development of this technology, the research that DARPA and others had funded relative to the development of the internet, how all of this technology kind of developed out of Silicon Valley, right, and Intel, and all of that intellectual property that gave us a running head start relative to how Microsoft and others became such a ubiquitous force across the world. Now, I think we're in a realization that we've given a lot of that up, and I think where do we go from here relative to staying ahead from an innovation perspective? I think the innovation culture in the United States is awesome. I think that, I know a lot of foreign nationals who come to the United States that are entrepreneurs because our culture supports their pursuits. We need to remain at the forefront in order to be able to, in some ways, stay ahead of the challenges that you're bringing up.
Yeah, and the question I have for you is, what's your sense of how the government is treating big tech right now? Because I look at that as sort of, if this is a world that's shifting from defense and I know this is a hard sell for some people right now because they're wrapped around the axle on Russia and Ukraine and the threat of a conventional war between the United States and China over Taiwan. But like we've been talking, I think a lot of the struggle for hearts and minds is happening in cyberspace. That big tech to me is sort of a security industrial complex, if you will, in a world that's heading from defense as a concept more towards security, which is much more granular on an everyday basis. And of course, your phone is the kind of choke point for that. It's where security and economics come together in this really, really profound way. And we have big tech companies that have put that together and yet have been enormously successful in spreading these technologies and these behavioral patterns around the world, reflecting our values, which is why they're challenging to a lot of the rest of the world. But, we've taken to viewing these entities now in sort of a trust-busting, end of the 19th century sort of robber barons perspective. And God knows the individuals on top certainly earn that sort of dissatisfaction by some of their behavior. And we've had this tendency to kind of view them as supermen and Tony Starks who can do anything across the board. And we've had that sort of fascination with them as fixers of problems and fixers of our society. But at the same time, we're kind of astonished at the wealth they've generated. Now they're putting their own people on the moon or going to space on their own. That seems extravagant and out of control. And our system tends to regrade the economic landscape on a regular basis to make sure that the rich don't get too rich and the poor don't get too poor. And I think we're in one of those angry moods right now.
Yeah, no, I agree that we're in one of those angry moods.
So how do we deal with big tech without sort of killing the golden goose that's been a lot of our influence and a lot of our, spread values around the world?
That's a very good question, Tom. And quite frankly, I don't have a good answer on that. However, I don't think that we should be hitting them with some of the sticks that they're getting hit with
right now,
because we need them to invest in the future. If the future is space, if the future is quantum, if the future is AI, we need that leadership to continue forward with those values that we find to be supportive. I think that obviously there's a huge ethical, the ethics and privacy and trust are kind of interlocked here in a lot of the issue that we're dealing with. And, fascinating, when you think about, and I love your concepts of Leviathan and the administrator, right? And sysadmin, yeah. And, as a law enforcement officer, I lined up on both sides. And, I benefited and supported the military and the intelligence community in order to be able to support Leviathan. And, at the same time, working with 190 countries in order to be able to support security from every package that gets on an airplane in the world, I had an impact on.
Mm-hmm.
And, when you think about those issues from a where does this go perspective, we've got, we see it play out in what Leviathan does in order to be able to surveil our adversaries and our allies.
Right.
And then, we expect the sysadmin to, play nice in the international playground to support security. The sysadmin has that role and responsibility of ethics, privacy, and trust, right?
Right.
And, Leviathan doesn't play with that.
No, Leviathan's out to win. And it's back to that distinction about a world shifting from defense to security. Defense is zero sum. The more I got, the more nervous you are, and vice versa. Whereas security is non-zero sum. We can both benefit from that. And, I think we're at a huge transition point in American history where we're starting to understand the limits of what hard power can accomplish. And we're looking at sort of legacy conflicts, and they feel like legacy conflicts in many ways. I know people look at the Russia-Ukraine thing and say, this is the future. I look at it and I see the past. Sure. I mean, they're fighting over territory. They're fighting over control that if they win it, will be too costly for them to sustain over
either side.
Right. So I compare that to what Putin had to spend to win a chunk of the Republican base. That was minuscule. I mean, that was negligible. That was pennies on the dollar. He's paying in blood and treasure to accomplish nothing in the real world using a big war force to create major conflict, whereas you can win on very small scale things. Heck, you can have a hand in picking the president of the United States if you play your cards right. And so that shift from the big war force, the Leviathan, to a more security-focused system administrator construct, I think we're struggling with that. We associate it with small wars and nation building and Iraq and Afghanistan, and we had our recent bout with that, and now we're all burned out on that subject. But, I wrote a piece recently that said, in effect, my concept of a sysadmin kind of entity, this notion of a force that was about connectivity and control and making things happen in a safe and secure fashion. The closest I've seen a government come to that is actually the Chinese. And I would call it the Belt and Road Initiative. They're building infrastructure. They're building networks. It's more civilian than military. It's more private sector than public sector. The PLA's there, but they're in the background. I mean, they are networking and capturing and building and creating a sense of security, whereas the United States is still stuck on thinking of the world, largely in terms of great power conflict, kinetic conflict. And I think that distinction between a kind of a physical hard power world and a cyber soft power world, we're not bridging it very well. And by treating big tech in a hostile way right now, I think we're damaging national assets of the highest importance.
I think one of the things that we need to think about relative to the conflict in Ukraine and Russia and some of the other conflicts that, one of the big instigators of conflict is a scarcity of resource, right?
Sure.
And, when we look at where we're going from a future state perspective, energy is one of the most important resources that we're going to have. Clean energy is one of the things that we're going to need to leverage in order to be able to address, I think, one of your passions, climate change,
Sure.
right? And, when we talk about innovation and future and, do we need to incentivize all of these modern robber barons to get into funding nuclear fusion? And, is that a path 20 years from now that would allow us to win longer term?
Back to this notion of the emergence of a global middle class, which puts tremendous pressures on us in terms of resource utilization. I mean, you go back 50 years and you're talking barely a quarter of the planet living at that kind of consumption level. And so what were our resource utilization models? They were amazingly inefficient because as far as we were concerned, this stuff was everywhere. It's not everywhere. We've run up against problems and limits to that. But when you add in all that new demand, we're talking about a global middle class that was a couple billion people in 2000, 4 billion people now, and will be more like 6 or 7 billion people by mid-century. Then that guarantees you a revolution in resource utilization. Has to happen. And no one is more incentivized than the Chinese to pursue every possible angle, to lock down every possible traditional source, to go after every new technology and exploit it to the maximum, including fusion and nuclear. And that's a great competitive landscape, I would argue. We have now a lot more governments, a lot more interested in pursuing a path that takes us down the carbon chain to less emissions. That goes along with our efforts to modulate climate change, but it's also it's a search for efficiency. And then it does kind of allow us, I think, in the United States to look at the world differently because, if you view us from a hemispheric perspective, the Americas as a whole, north, south, central, the Arctic and whatnot, that is a fairly self-sufficient package on energy, no matter how you measure it up. And it's a self-sufficient package on water, and it's a self-sufficient package on food. So if we're looking towards that future, I would say it's not a matter of kind of countering the Chinese anywhere. 10 barrels come out of the Persian Gulf, on a notional basis. One of them goes to the Western Hemisphere. 9 of them go to East Asia. So if I look at the Middle East and that part of the world and say, should that be our problem set to deal with? Well, I think the Chinese and India and Japan and South Korea and East Asia in general are a lot more incentivized to care about that. And then the question for us becomes, if they are, and if we can live with that incentivization and their desire to have more control over their access, well, given our resource advantages, why aren't we more interested in integrating, say, the rest of the Western Hemisphere at this point, where trade integration, levels of trade integration in our neck of the woods are far lower than they are in East Asia, far lower than they are in the world leader in this, the European Union. So why aren't we trying to integrate and take advantage of those possibilities in our own neck of the woods when we have an energy profile now that allows us that sort of self-sufficiency and self-confidence? I think the leaks that the U.S. military has suffered over the last 10 to 15 years, they come with kind of greater importance and higher frequency over time, just points out that the notion of conducting wars and conducting police actions and engaging in any of this activity without kind of a radical transparency reality baked into your approach, I think is mistaken, because it all comes out in the end.
Yeah, I think transparency is something that's important here. The notion of privacy is interesting, and the prevalence, the near kind of ubiquitous nature of data and information and collection is only accelerating. There's so much information, and there's going to be so much more, and the ability to transform that information into different sets of value for the purpose of Leviathan or for the purpose of sysadmin, I think is something that we need to really take a step back and consider, because we all want data security and privacy, but we also want transparency and access. And obviously these breaches have been of the public trust. They've been something to be concerned about. But in the same respect, the world is so data centric. Is it possible for us to leverage all of this technology with this use of data in this way that, where's this all go?
Right. I mean, to me, cybersecurity as a goal becomes more elusive and more fantastic over time in terms of the control of data. And so I think the resilience you need to build into your system is not, can you dam up everything as much as possible and prevent leakage? It's really, how does your system handle what is going to be kind of a nonstop leakage problem, going forward. And there, I would say the United States is highly advantaged. I would say any democracy is highly advantaged vis-a-vis an authoritarian government because they're not built for that sort of leakage. We are. I mean, we have ways of dealing with it, and frankly, as a citizen, I usually feel a certain amount of relief when things hit the front page of the New York Times because, and having worked in the security realm myself, it's something you want to respect, and yet you feel confident that the American system can handle this sort of honesty and transparency, whereas other governments can't. And I think we need to look around sort of how we handle these breaches more so than how do we technologically prevent them, because I don't think you can prevent them. On some level, the libertarian in me says, I want the truth to come out on a fairly regular basis because that's what keeps us honest. And I think it's important for our brand that we show how we handle it and handle it well, because ultimately I think that's how we win more hearts and minds around the world, not, the efficiency in clamping down on whistleblowers and stuff like that, which just puts us in the same sort of category as the Russians and the Chinese who do that on such a broad and pervasive basis. I mean, we're at a turning point in history where, thanks to the loss of the wage differential that had been so profound in East Asia for a period of 20 years, that really defined most people's understanding of globalization, which is we send everything to Asia and it all comes back. Okay. And that doesn't make sense anymore now because Asia has risen. People want better salaries, better life. They have more consumption. And China now consumes a lot more of what it makes. So our definition of globalization isn't send it to the farthest point on the planet and then bring it all the way back because labor is so cheap there. And that kind of coterminous with the Great Recession has created a flatlining of the goods trade of globalization. And a lot of people look at that and say, well, that's deglobalization. Well, it's deglobalization if your definition of global economics is only physical trade. Because at the same time, the bandwidth usage and the data flows have gone through the roof in the last 10 to 15 years, like something like 50-fold increase. And so if before it was cheap transportation that got us the physical globalization dynamic, now it's cheap communications that gets us this digitalized globalization. And, all the things we've been talking about, sort of how do we balance the real world and the kinetic world and the world of hardware and violence and things like Russia and Ukraine versus things like Putin interfering in the 2016 election. I mean, those are of equal importance, I would argue, in many ways. And as you shift from a physical definition, a physical dominated definition of globalization to one that's more cyber and digital, I think that kind of penetration that was accomplished by Putin in the 2016 election is actually the bigger fish to fry. So when you are at this point in history and you're, I would argue, burdened by a boomer generation that aren't digital natives, that don't really understand it. We've all seen the SNL skits on that, where they don't know what their Twitter account really is all about and stuff like that. It's dangerous now to have leadership that defaults to this kind of Cold War perspective, get me more carriers, get me more tanks, get me more aircraft as the answer to the threat or the competitive challenge that China represents, because I think we can handle all that. I think we're really smart about that. What we are falling behind on is the cyber realm. And if the shift of globalization from physical goods centric to digital goods centric, and McKinsey will tell you today, more than half the global trade value is digital. Okay. That should be a big sign that we need to rethink our definitions of security and power and standing. And we need to kind of, as our discussion has, we need to kind of move beyond defense and more into the realm of security, which is, like I like to point out, non-zero sum. Defense, you tend to scare people the more you have. And look at China. As it builds up its military, we get more scared. But we have to balance that perspective and that world and that competition with the one that's unfolding in the digital realm, where I would argue the Chinese threat is much more profound, and we're doing a much less better job of trying to match it. In many ways, I don't think we're even aware of it.
From my perspective, I've enjoyed the conversation, Tom. Thanks for
I have as well.
taking the time. This has been really enjoyable.
So again, that was really a fascinating discussion with Greg. And as sort of an end note or side note to our discussion, Greg talked about my distinction between the Leviathan force and the so-called sysadmin force, which you can think about just in terms of the big war force, the Leviathan, versus kind of a small wars, security building force. That big war Leviathan force tends to be the Navy. It tends to be the Air Force. That smaller security, nation building, counterinsurgency, counter-terror force, that tends to be the green force. More Army, more Marines, more special operations. And I guess one of the things that surprised me about our conversation is how that distinction has lingered in the minds of a lot of people in the national security community, stemming from a book I published 20 years ago called The Pentagon's New Map. The reason why we're having these conversations and putting them out as podcasts is it's part of Throughline's effort to gear up awareness and to promote the book that we've created here with I as principal author, but also involving illustrators and data visualization experts at Throughline. The book comes out in September, late September, the 26th. It's by Ben Bella Books, and the title is America's New Map, Restoring Our Global Leadership in an Era of Climate Change and Demographic Collapse. We thought it would be interesting to have this discussion with Greg, given his cybersecurity background. A lot of the book involves our cybersecurity approach, the United States, and how that's becoming front and center of our rivalry and competition with the Chinese for influence around the world. So this is the first of what we hope will be a number of conversations that we'll tape and put out there as podcasts over the next several months as we build up towards the publication date of America's New Map, the book, which will come out in September of this year on the 26th. And for more information about the book and to follow along as we publish these podcasts, please come to the website devoted to it, www.americas, so an S on the end, newmap.com. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time.